This is Jeff Blauette, Cooperative Farmers Elevator Technical Agronomist. Today in our Field Friday segment, here we are this last week of August. I thought we'd talk about one of our soybean nemesises that have just started to show up here recently, especially in Lyon and Sioux County, where we have some of these heavier black soils with a manure history. We sometimes have problems with getting beans to stay standing, and in those areas we get this problem show up. Sclerotinia white mold, various different names for it, but it's becoming a problem again this year. I kind of had hoped maybe in that July time frame when we were kind of hot and dry, we maybe it will shorten these beans where they wouldn't get too tall and tip over. That turned out not to be the case. We've had enough dampness and enough moisture, and now with some rains recently, we've had these beans kind of really flare up in the bottoms like they oftentimes do. And I thought we'd talk about white mold and what it is, what it does, what we can do about it this year and maybe going forward. If we look at these fields, we've got most of the time constrained to these heavy bottom soils. The hillsides typically aren't a problem unless the field has quite a history to spread that white mold infestation around, but it's typically where the beans don't stand as well late season on these highly productive soils. That's where we typically will see the problem. There isn't really any great control mechanisms other than some cultural practices and variety selection, but we can talk about a few of the factors here. First thing is probably early identification. If we've got some of these fields, especially in areas where you might have some sudden death as well, we can maybe look at some of these when they very first start showing up. These leaves are kind of that interveinal chlorosis, start to wilt. We don't get the yellowing as much as you do with SDS. It's more of just that plant just looks like it just is diseased and sickly. Well, it is, but that's not what these leaves are showing. They're just showing that this plant is now dead. The sun started to bleach those leaves, they've dried down, and it's because of this. If you can see this small area of that stem around this node where that white mold infestation started, you can see the mold on the stem. So only a 3-4 inch section of the stem is dead at this point, but it's choked off the flow within that plant, and that plant is dead. It's not growing anymore. Even though this stem is green, its history, it's going to shrivel up and turn to nothing, and it's going to look barren in the fall, you might say. This plant, you can see the leaves are now brown. These leaves and the petioles and these black dried up leaves, they'll still be there in the fall. When you pull through the fall, all the other beans have lost their leaves, but if you get into areas with all these brown or black leaves still hanging on, you're probably looking at white mold. And guys that have had it before a lot of times are familiar with that in the bottoms, but you can see the bigger section of this stem, probably a foot or more of this stem is choked off now and has white mold on it. You can see these pods have shrunk away to nothing already. The rest will do that soon. You can see that happening already. And if you look closely, you can see that black, looks like rat turds, this sclerotia forming on that stem. And that's just another symptom of what the white mold is going to do to the rest of that plant. So what can we do about it? Obviously, there's nothing we can do about it here today. This area of the field is going to continue to probably get worse as more plants start to die off. There's nothing you can do late season that's going to help with this disease and this problem in soybeans. The unfortunate part with white mold, there isn't any great fungicides. The ones that are there are quite expensive, and the decision's got to be made a long time ago. This isn't something we can start to see show up and then deal with it. You've got to pretty much assume that you're going to have it and spend the money early. A lot of these white mold infestations probably happened in early July, so 6-7 weeks ago. They don't manifest themselves until the conditions come later here in the summer, and then we've got a problem. If they infested in early July, we're not putting fungicides on yet, and we won't know we're going to have conditions for a problem until later. So it becomes an issue because there are some fungicides. University of Wisconsin probably has the most data. They tend to have the most problem with white mold. There are a few fungicides, biological and otherwise, that have some activity on white mold, but they're kind of expensive, probably more than most guys would want to spend unless you're absolutely certain you have a problem. And sometimes you have to put 2 applications on, maybe an R1, that first week of July, and then 10 days to 2 weeks later, you have to have another application. I know about how popular that would be, and that's why not much of it happens, if any of it. Variety selection is probably one of the biggest things that we can do. There are no completely resistant varieties, but there are some that are much better than others. This one happens to be a susceptible variety in an area we didn't expect white mold to be a problem, so we didn't put a highly defensive variety in for this area, and we got hit. And you can see it's taking over this small area in the bottom here. If you look at the black rat turds that showed up on this plant, when they go through the combine, end up on the ground, that's future infestation of that the sclerotia, and they'll lay in the soil if you disc them under for quite a number of years. 1 or 2 years of corn is not going to get rid of them. Even if we bury them 6-8 inches deep and then till them up a few years later, they'll still be viable. So it's not easy to get rid of. If we have something we can do, this is kind of the challenge. Narrow row beans are more advantageous for yield unless we have white mold issues. White mold is more conducive in narrow rows because we get closed canopy quicker, cut that airflow down so that canopy inside stays damp, which is a disease, a fungal condition that's, hospitable to most diseases. We get that earlier in narrow row beans than we do in wider row beans. So that's one downside to the narrow row beans in soybeans. If we want to look at some of the other things that we could do, no-till helps. If you think about those black sclerotia in the soil, they're going to create spores and kind of disperse those up into the lower canopy. If they're laying on the surface, they're going to do that next year. In a rotated field, you're going to have corn out here, and corn is not susceptible. So that's a good thing. Problem is, if we go out and disc it up next year, we're turning all those sclerotia over that were there before, and we're creating those infestations near the surface again. So then the next year it goes to soybeans, we've got that same problem. No-till, we're not turning that soil over. So year 1, we go ahead and have those spores ejected into that lower canopy trying to infest the beans, but it's corn. That's good. If we go in a no-till, we're not turning over new spores and new sclerotia to create those spores. That cuts back on the likelihood of an infestation. There is still a tiny amount of tillage that goes on with the disc openers, and if you have the residue managers down moving some soil, you could bring some more to the surface there on a small amount of the acre. And if it's a heavy infestation, no-till's not the solution, it's a tool to help. This field happened to be a no-till field, so it's not for sure bulletproof, but it definitely helps. One of the other things that I know in Wisconsin is more prevalent, we maybe need to do some more playing around with it here, applying Cobra late season. By late season, I'm talking, kind of around that first week of July. Kind of at that R1 time frame. What Cobra does, even though it's a herbicide, that effect it has on that soybean plant, we all know it burns the beans quite severely short term. They grow out of it fine, but in that manner of stunting those beans or burning those beans, there's a on-label proven potential for what they call SAR, systemic acquired resistance. When we get that effect on those soybeans, that kind of gives them a little period of time where they've got their own defenses up, you might say, and if infestation tries to happen shortly after that, the beans kind of have their defensive shield up and they won't get as much white mold into that plant, and that's supposed to help. We haven't done a lot of it. We did do, here at CFE, we've got 5 different trials out this year. We've got 2 that are specifically in white mold fields. So we're looking at some of this stuff, and we'll have some results this fall to see if we had any impact on white mold and what it did to yield with or without white mold, and that's always a question we have as well. There is a soil-applied herbicide or a fungicide that it's a biological you can use called Contans. That's got to be done in the spring, probably incorporated lightly. We haven't done much with it. It's quite expensive, and you're basically betting that you're going to have the problem. But if you have areas of the field that have a history, you know more often than not you're going to have white mold. Maybe it's just in 5 acres here, 5 acres there. It may be worth considering to try something like that. But just know that it's not easy. There's a lot of little things, and we're kind of having to do some things before the infestation happens. It's kind of like the residual soil herbicides. We're trying to put those out, betting that we're going to get more weed pressure coming. With white mold, we're kind of having to do the same thing. We're going to bet we have to spend the money anyway, so we're going to have to do it before it shows up. That's just the only way we can deal with this disease. If you think about it, here we are. This stuff probably showed up in this field maybe a week to 10 days ago, which would have been middle of August. The infestation happens usually around the flower sites in the plant when they're flowering, and that started happening in early July. So we've had this infestation in this plant probably for a month before it really showed up. It took a little time for it to do its thing and to choke that plant off. But we just need to understand the timing of things and the ability for us to go fix it after it happens. It isn't going to happen. So all we can do is know the infestation potential, know what we can do about it potentially going forward. If these fields have problems this year, probably going back to beans in 2 years, understand that we maybe want to address that and try and do some preventative things. And the agronomist at CFE can help you with that. Every field situation is different. We can try and figure out what might help you to make your soybean field the most productive, and try not to let these better producing soils be your worst producing areas because of the disease issues that showed up this year. So with that, that's this week's Field Friday segment, and we'll see you next week.